GoSoutheastern.com.
Exclusive.
Welcome again to The Total Athlete, an exclusive to GoSoutheastern.com. I'm Luke Wellman. I'm joined by Ed First, who's a licensed marriage and family counselor, a licensed professional counselor, and a certified sports counselor. Ed works here at Southeastern Oklahoma State University and is volunteering his time from Student Support Services to be with us today. Thanks again for joining us, Ed.
It's good to be here, Luke.
Very good. We got to get our disclaimer in. We want to be clear that this discussion is purely educational in nature, not a substitute for counseling, and if anything you hear today triggers something in you, we ask you to seek professional help. So today, Ed, we're going to talk about an idea of regulating our emotions. Emotions are a part of athletics and have been for years. In fact, it's what a lot of athletes say is the reason they play sports is because of the emotions it stirs within them. But we're going to talk about how to best regulate those emotions. What do you mean when you hear the term emotional regulation?
Yeah, in regard to emotional regulation, as far as sports and student athletes are concerned, what we're really talking about is how do they manage their emotions in terms of what kind of self-control or poise do they display out there when they're competing in a way that either harms their performance or helps their performance, especially as it relates to the way they relate to opponents, coaches, teammates, officials, and whatever happens out there during competition.
Very good. Well, let's pick a couple emotions and talk specifically about those. Let's use some emotional examples. Let's pick fear and anger, two very common emotions in the field of competition.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about using those examples. Let's talk about emotional regulation and a couple ways that student athletes and athletes can regulate those emotions.
Okay, so briefly, we're going to talk about three today. The first one is excessive flight. The second one is freezing, and the third one is excessive flight. So starting off with excessive fight, the example I would give on that is we'll see a lot of athletes that when they get frustrated, suddenly they'll have outbursts. They might do silly things like frustration fouls. I'm thinking of an example where Tyson got frustrated because Holyfield was really beating him in the round and bit his ear off.
A famous example. Yeah.
Famous, maybe an extra shove or a headbutting, sometimes spitting in an umpire's face.
Roberto Alomar did that famously, and now a Hall of Famer.
Okay, and so really it's just kind of a form of impatient attacking because there's an inability to regulate that fight reflex.
Okay, the next one you mentioned was freezing.
Yeah, freezing is less common, but it does happen more than we might think. It has to do more with just kind of shutting down. There's a kind of a paralyzed excessive introspection, maybe like almost a little bit like stage fright, but basically the athlete has frozen emotions.
Example being maybe at the end of a game, big free throw where the moment gets to a student athlete, they might tense up on that game-winning or game-tying free throw.
Yeah, and we often refer to that as choking.
Okay, and how about excessive flight?
Yeah, and excessive flight, the thing about that is a little trickier is it just has to do with kind of a retreating or a fearful withdrawal. And where I see this happening a lot and kind of sneaks up on coaches and teams is when a team is being really aggressive and being very successful attacking. Let's say in basketball, they're doing a lot of fast breaks, they're speeding up the tempo by pressing, and all of a sudden they decide to change the tempo and they decide to just stall or play more slow or slow the game down, or maybe do the same thing in soccer or hockey. Well, all of a sudden they're playing not to lose rather than playing to win. And what happens oftentimes is the opponent, much like a dog can sense a fear in a person when they're afraid, the opponent can sense when a team is playing not to lose and kind of more out of a flight mode rather than a fight mode. And that triggers a kill switch in the opponents, and oftentimes the momentum will shift and the team that was losing will change the momentum of the game and turn around, and that team will then start to win.
The proverbial cliche, blood is in the water. Opponents always sense that. I'm reminded of a friend who always says, prevent defense only prevents you from winning, in using the football analogy.
That's a great analogy.
All right, so what are some basic steps any athlete can take to help regulate their emotions in a positive way instead of having some of these negative consequences we talked about?
And I think athletes need to really consider four main things. I simplified this. They need to be able to identify their feelings. They need to be able to accept and connect those feelings with certain behaviors that aren't working well for them. They need to be able to contain their feelings, and they need to learn how to express their feelings or in some cases suppress them, but basically express them in a way that involves self-control. So on the identifying of the feelings, what I mean by that is you can't think your way into your feelings, you can only feel your way into them. So a lot of times when you're asking an athlete, what do you feel? They'll say, well, I feel that that coach did that, or I feel that that opponent did this, and they're really not talking about their own feelings. So you have to get them on track to realize, listen, you're talking about your thoughts, we need you to talk about your feelings. You know, learn to label your own feelings. The second part is accepting and connecting, and if they can just take that feeling that led to that inappropriate behavior that didn't work for them, maybe they got frustrated and committed a foul, or they got off their game plan, if they can just look at those behaviors that follow and make that connection between the behavior and the feeling, then they have a better chance of becoming aware of that behavior and stopping that behavior. And then the containing is, it's almost like, you know, you imagine a little kid trying to contain a bee in a bottle. You know, that bee's going to sting him perhaps until he gets that bee contained in that bottle. When it comes to athletes regulating their emotions, they need to contain the fear, the anger, whatever's bothering them, so that they have enough self-control to decide what to do with it. And that leads into the last part, expressing or suppressing. And so what we're talking about there is trying to come up with situations, game-like scenarios, where athletes can practice rechanneling these frustrations that they have or practice self-control.
Very good. And we should note that no bees were hurt in the making of this episode of The Total Athlete. There's a student athlete or maybe a coach out there watching today, Ed, that says, okay, that rings true with my team, and that rings true with me. Do you have any exercises? Do you have any things that they can do, whether in a practice scenario, that they can learn from, so it's not getting this experience through competition? They can actually be prepared as they go into play?
Well, Luke, since we're approaching basketball season, I decided to give 2 examples related to basketball. So
Perfect.
A good basketball drill is a rebounding drill, where what you would do is you would have your athletes line up, and there's really no offense, no defense here. It's just whoever gets the rebound. But in order to set up a scenario to develop some toughness and some ability for your athletes to handle adversity, don't call any fouls. I mean, you wouldn't allow punching or anything, but shoving and pushing and every other kind of thing that happens, that's perfectly okay, knowing that the athletes are going to be frustrated. And then you might set up a deal where you have 2 teams against each other in the rebounding drill, and the first team to 2 wins, but pretty much there are no rules. Another example would be setting up a scrimmage where you intentionally, as the coach, set up referees where you make unfair calls during the scrimmage. The idea is that you want your athletes to learn how to handle unfair calls that happen during the game without reacting in a frustration foul or without talking about back to the referee or whatever. But you make the game close, and even if the team that looks like it's about to win, you make an unfair call against that team toward the end of the game so that they might potentially lose, and just see how they manage those emotions. Those are good, practical, hands-on experiences to practice regulating emotions.
And all ways to turn those negative situations into potential positives by overcoming them.
It's exactly right. And so what we're talking about is self-control and poise, and it takes practice.
Very good. That's a look at emotional regulation on this week's edition of The Total Athlete. For Ed First, I'm Luke Willman. Hope you join us a couple weeks from now, right here on GoSoutheastern.com.